On the windswept plains of Wyoming, where loneliness echoes louder than any storm, a woman stood quietly at the edge of her own life, until a stranger's voice shattered the stillness. "I need a wife, and you need strong sons." Those were the first words Boaz Cutter ever said to Abigail Wynne, a schoolteacher known more for her silence than for stirring anyone's heart. His offer wasn't romantic. It wasn't tender. It was practical. Almost cold. But it was also the first time someone had seen her not as someone waiting, but as someone worthy of building something with. This is not a tale of sweeping passion or whispered courtships. It's the story of two people who entered into a marriage of necessity, and found something far deeper than either expected. It's a story about strength, choices, and how love can grow quietly, like roots beneath hard earth. Let us begin. Abigail Wynne had grown used to silence. Not just the kind that lingered after lessons ended in her one-room prairie schoolhouse, but the kind that came from living a life others passed by without noticing. She was 33, unmarried, dignified, self-contained, and quietly vanishing into the margins of a Wyoming town that prized youth and husbands. Then came Boaz Cutter. A man built like the land itself, broad, weathered, and utterly unmovable. He walked into her classroom one wind-bitten morning, removed his hat with deliberate respect and looked her square in the eyes. "I need a wife," he said. No greeting. No hesitation. Just that. "And you," he added after a pause, "need strong sons." The room stood still. Abigail blinked, unsure if she'd heard right. Not even a flicker of emotion crossed his face. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a question. It was a statement of terms. In that moment, something inside Abigail stirred, not romantic yearning, not fear, but a sudden, piercing awareness. He's not lying. He's not playing games. And for the first time, someone is offering me a choice. She could have laughed, could have been insulted, could have told him to leave. Instead, she did something no one, perhaps not even Boaz, expected. She asked quietly, "Why me?" Boaz's reply was as unadorned as his proposal. "Because you read more than you speak. Because you don't scare easy. And because I've seen how you teach those children, not with gentleness but with steadiness." "I don't need gentleness. I need steady." The room, the prairie, the life she'd built, it all felt suddenly too small. And in the silence that followed, Abigail Wynne realized she was being offered not a romance, but a kind of freedom. Not the fairy tale she'd been raised to expect, but a future she could shape with her own hands. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough to say yes. The townspeople called it a strange match. Boaz Cutter, the widowed cattleman with scars on his hands and silence in his eyes. Abigail Wynne, the unmarried schoolteacher whose dignity was mistaken for distance. No one heard the agreement they made that day, but everyone felt its aftershocks. There was no ring, no lace, no church bells. Only a handshake in the late afternoon light, and a sentence from Boaz that sounded more like a vow than a proposal. "I'll build you a house where the roof holds through winter." That was how Abigail left behind her schoolhouse and the rows of students whose futures she once guarded like treasure. She traded her chalk for the hard rhythm of prairie life, where dawn meant milking, dusk meant mending, and each season demanded something new from her hands. Yet there was no resentment in her. Only resolve. Because this was her choice, not one forced by desperation, but accepted with quiet calculation. At first, Boaz kept his word and not much else. He built a cabin that stood against the Wyoming wind. He kept to his work, spoke little, and came home every evening with dust in his beard and sweat in his collar. They lived like two strangers sharing the same storm shelter, civil, capable, but oceans apart in spirit. And still, something curious began to take root. In the smallest of moments, in the way Boaz brought her firewood before she asked, or how Abigail laid out his supper with calm precision, they carved out a kind of rhythm. Not affection. Not yet. But mutual steadiness. A strange kind of trust. One night, as the wind howled around their cabin and frost traced patterns across the glass, Boaz paused before bed, glanced at Abigail and said simply, "You're not afraid of this life." She didn't answer aloud. But in the silence between them, something unspoken settled, like the first snow on untouched ground. Neither of them knew it yet. But love, the kind that doesn't announce itself with flowers or poems, had quietly begun to form, built not on fire but on flint. Life on the Cutter Ranch didn't leave much room for sentiment. The cattle didn't wait for kind words. The wind didn't pause for tenderness. And Boaz remained a man of few syllables whose affection, if it existed, lived somewhere between his calloused palms and unbroken gaze. But Abigail began to understand him, through the language of small things. He never praised her bread, yet she noticed how he always reached for a second slice. He never asked about her loneliness, but he built her a reading nook by the window with his own hands. No announcement. No explanation. Just a quiet gift of space and sunlight. And when her mare went into a difficult labor one morning, Abigail found him already in the stable, mud-soaked, eyes focused, hands steady as he helped deliver the foal. He never looked at her. Just whispered to the trembling animal, "Come on now, girl. One more push." That day she saw something in him that the town had never noticed. A gentleness buried beneath the grit. Not soft but deeply human. In return, Abigail gave Boaz something he'd forgotten he needed. Presence. She didn't fill the silence with chatter. She didn't ask him to be someone he wasn't. But she saw him. Heard the words he didn't speak. And slowly, like a desert after rain, he began to bloom in small, stubborn ways. He started asking if she'd eaten. Leaving a carved button on her sewing table. Fixing the squeaky door before she could mention it. They were gestures so quiet most would miss them, but Abigail didn't. One evening, as she stood at the edge of their field watching the horizon, Boaz stepped beside her. No words. Just two silhouettes facing the wind. And in that stillness she realized something. She had not married for love. But love, in its most honest form, was finding its way to her, not with fireworks but with footsteps. Not fast but true. It began with whispers, low, biting words that crept through the town like prairie fire. "She's just a maid in a schoolteacher's dress." He married her for convenience, not for love. "Have you seen how he never touches her hand?" Abigail heard it all. Not directly but in the way shopkeepers paused when she entered. In the glances that slid off her like rain from stone. They had always looked past her, now they looked through her. And it stung more than she expected. But Boaz didn't notice. Or so she thought. Until one evening, after Sunday supper, he did something he had never done before. As she reached for his plate, he stopped her hand and looked straight into her eyes. "I heard what they said," he said simply. She blinked, startled by his directness. "And? They don't know what it means to build something from the ground up. To earn every inch of trust. Every breath of peace. You do." Then quieter, "So do I." That night he didn't kiss her. He didn't hold her. But he did something that meant even more. He brought out his mother's old music box, the one he kept locked in a drawer, and wound it gently. The melody was faint, like a lullaby from another life. Then he placed it on the windowsill of her reading nook and walked away. It was his way of saying, "You belong here. In this house. In this life." And yet, the storm outside grew stronger. When a letter arrived from Boaz's estranged brother in Texas, offering money to buy out the ranch, Abigail saw something flicker in her husband's eyes. Doubt. He didn't say yes. But he didn't say no either. That night, as the wind howled and shutters shook, Abigail sat alone by the music box, watching its delicate ballerina spin beneath the moonlight. She realized then, this life they were building, this quiet companionship, it wasn't indestructible. It could be sold. Or walked away from. And suddenly, her heart ached with a truth she hadn't dared admit before. She wanted him to choose them, not because he had to, but because he could. Because even a marriage born of necessity deserves to be fought for. Especially when it had begun to bloom into something neither of them had expected. Autumn arrived without warning, crisp, golden, and laced with questions unspoken. At the town's annual harvest festival, couples filled the barn floor, swinging and swaying beneath fairy lights strung from wooden beams. Abigail stood by the cider stand, a polite smile fixed on her lips, her eyes scanning the room, but not for anyone else. Just for him. Boaz was across the barn, leaning against a support post, arms crossed. Watching her. They hadn't spoken of the letter again. But its silence echoed between them, louder than any fiddle tune in the air. Suddenly, through the crowd, Boaz began walking toward her, slow, steady, deliberate. No flourish. No fanfare. Just the quiet determination of a man who had made up his mind. And then, without asking, without even a word, he held out his hand. The music shifted to a waltz. Abigail hesitated only a second before placing her hand in his. Their hands didn't fit perfectly. He moved with the stiffness of a man not used to dancing, and she with the caution of a woman not used to being seen. But as they moved, something changed. The room softened around them. People turned to watch, not with malice but with curiosity. And then, slowly, with wonder. Because something about the way Boaz looked at her. It wasn't duty. It wasn't obligation. It was choice. Halfway through the song he leaned close, his voice low and hoarse. I told my brother to take his money and choke on it. Abigail blinked, startled. He added, this ranch isn't for sale. Not the land. Not the house. Not us. Her breath caught. He continued, his words clumsy but sure, I don't dance, Abby. You know that. But I couldn't stand another night watching someone else see what I see and not act. For the first time in weeks, Abigail's eyes shimmered, but not from hurt. From clarity. That night they didn't just dance. They declared. To the town. To the whisperers. To each other. That what they had, though born from necessity, was no longer built on need. It was now built on want. And no money in Texas could buy that. It was late November when the knock came. A cold wind rattled the windows of the ranch house as Abigail folded linens by the firelight. Boaz was out tending to a calf born too early, and for a brief moment all was still. Until that slow, deliberate knock, a sound that didn't ask permission but assumed it, cut through the quiet. She opened the door. And there stood the woman Boaz had once nearly married. Her name was Elaine Crawford, a vision of polished ambition wrapped in a tailored coat, the kind that had never seen mud or hay or honest sweat. Her eyes flicked over Abigail, taking in the plain sweater, the worn apron, the warmth of the home behind her, and coolly dismissed it all. Is Boaz home? She asked as though she had every right to ask. Abigail didn't flinch. He's in the barn. Elaine nodded but didn't move. Then maybe you and I can talk. Abigail stepped aside, not out of fear but because she had nothing to hide. Inside, the fire crackled as Elaine eased into the chair that had once belonged to Boaz's mother. She looked around, clearly searching for something out of place, something to confirm whatever quiet doubt she had come with. Finally she said, I thought Boaz would tire of this arrangement. That it was convenience. Duty. A land deal dressed up in romance. Abigail smiled faintly. So did I once. Elaine pressed on. He's worth more than this. Than chickens and soil. He could have had 10 times this life. Abigail set the folded linen down carefully. Then why didn't he? That question hung in the air like wood smoke. Before Elaine could answer, the door creaked open, and Boaz entered, mud still clinging to his boots. His eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of Elaine, but he said nothing. Instead, he walked straight to Abigail, kissed her forehead without hesitation, and slipped his hand into hers. Elaine rose. I just needed to see it for myself, she said, voice quieter now. To believe it was real. Boaz replied gently but firmly, it's real because we chose it. Every day. And with that Elaine left. No dramatics. No slamming doors. Just the slow retreat of a woman who'd come hoping to reclaim something she never truly understood, and left having witnessed what love actually looks like. Not polished. Not perfect. But rooted, steady, and real enough to withstand both storms and temptation. That night, as they watched the fire flicker, Abigail whispered, Thank you for choosing me. Boaz replied, Every day. Especially the days I don't deserve you. And in the silence that followed, nothing needed to be said. Because everything had been. Time passed and the quiet countryside life returned to its usual rhythm. But for those who had witnessed that moment, when Elaine Crawford left in silence, her eyes finally grasping what she had never truly seen, it never really faded. Then one day a cream-colored envelope appeared in the mailbox by the gate. No return address. Just elegant handwriting, Boaz and Abigail. Inside was an invitation, a grand charity gala in the city, where the elite of finance and society would gather. The theme, Sowing Hope, from barren soil to harvest. Host, Elaine Crawford. Abigail looked at the card, then at Boaz. There was no anger in her eyes, only quiet surprise and a touch of reflection. You think, this is a challenge? Boaz smiled. Or an apology dressed in glitter and stage lights. Abigail traced the edge of the card gently. We'll go. And so, on the night of the gala, they stepped into the glow of the city, in the simplest attire acceptable for such a glamorous venue. Yet it was they, with a calm and integrity radiating from every step, who made the silks and shimmering ties around them seem dull. When Elaine stepped onto the stage to speak, her eyes scanned the room, and stopped at the two standing in the back, quiet and composed. No theatrics. No pretense. Yet impossible to overlook. Elaine smiled, a genuine smile for the first time without triumph. I once thought success was about conquering. But I've come to realize, sometimes true success is knowing when to step back, and learning to respect what can't be bought. The room fell silent. And in the back, Boaz gently squeezed Abigail's hand, a silent affirmation. Not a victory. Not revenge. But recognition. And a full circle ending. Because true love doesn't need to be proved with words. It only needs to stand firm, even when the world tries to shake it. And that night, under the lights of the city, no one shone brighter than they did. Some stories don't end with thunder or applause. They end in stillness, the kind that lingers in the heart long after the lights have dimmed. Abigail didn't fight back with fury. She didn't try to prove her worth with diamonds or status. She simply stood, with grace, with quiet strength, and with a love that asked for nothing but truth. And Boaz? He never needed the world to see him rise. He only needed one person to stand beside, someone who saw his worth before the world ever did. In a room filled with wealth, it was not the richest who taught the lesson that night. It was the woman they once dismissed, and the man who had chosen her, again and again, in silence and in faith. Let this be a reminder. Dignity does not shout. It simply refuses to bow. And love, real love, doesn't sparkle for the crowd. It glows quietly, steadily, and never burns out. Thank you for listening.